Good morning. It is Sunday, September the 1st, 2024. We're continuing in a series of messages out of the book of Daniel, and this message has the same title as last week, Just Say No. We'll look specifically at the third chapter of the book of Daniel this morning. Last Sunday, we examined Daniel's response to the first test of his faith during his captivity in Babylon. Even though his city had been conquered and he and his friends had been taken captive by a foreign power, Daniel chose to remain faithful when offered food and drink that would have led to defilement. Daniel resisted pressure from those who were concerned about their own safety because of his decision, and he persisted in doing what he knew to be the right thing. Daniel chose to say no, and God blessed him and his friends as a result. This morning, we'll look at a second situation where saying no is the appropriate response for a believer. We are going to learn that we must say no to threats. We'll begin in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 3 and read through verse 7. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then in verse 3 of chapter 3, so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. Then they stood before the statue Nebuchadnezzar had set up. A herald loudly proclaimed, "People of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." Then in verse 6, but whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, when all the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, and every kind of music, people of every nation and language fell down and worshipped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The king that had taken Daniel and his friends captive built a giant golden idol, and King Nebuchadnezzar declared everyone was to worship before it as commanded. And when the music played, what happened? The masses did as they were told. They bowed down to an idol of a false god, and they did it out of fear, not out of admiration, not out of adoration, but out of fear. After all, a serious threat had been issued. If you do not comply, you would burn. How many people in this world today comply with things they know are not right, and they do so out of fear? Fear of losing their jobs, fear of losing friends, or simply the fear of not fitting in with everyone else. We'll see how Daniel's friends dealt with the threat that they faced in a moment. But first, let's understand that when we choose to do the right thing, others will notice and cause trouble. Continuing to read in Daniel chapter 3, verses 8 through 15. It says in verse 8, some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Then in verse 12, there are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Then it says in verse 13, in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? Do you think that the Chaldeans noticed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's noncompliance because they were true believers and were righteously indignant? Do you think they turned in Daniel's friends because their great faith in the false god was offended by the men's refusal to acknowledge the fake deity as ordered? I, for one, do not. Would you like to know why? I want you to look at verse 12 again and make note of a few things. It says there are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Notice that the Chaldean accusers pointed out that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Jews. We should note that the Chaldeans were already enemies of the Jewish people, and their special hatred for Daniel's friends was highlighted when they pointed out their heritage. Also, notice that in their accusation, they said the three men had ignored the king and failed to serve and worship the king's gods and his statue. They didn't say our gods, they said your gods to the king. I also believe there was clear undertones of jealousy and a powerful desire to see the three Jews removed from their positions of influence. And the accusers saw this as the perfect opportunity to get what they wanted. When we make the right choice and say no, others may seize upon what they believe is an opportunity to get us into trouble or even to get rid of us. And as a result, making the right choice may mean that we have to endure a trial by fire. We'll pick up in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not, it says in verse 18, rescue us. We want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Then in verse 19 of Daniel chapter 3, then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of the best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men, in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. It says in verse 22, since the king's command was so urgent, and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. When we do the right thing and say no, threats made against us may not be carried out. Sometimes simply standing firm is enough, and those who threaten us will back down. But other times we will have to endure embarrassment, punishment, or possibly even torment because of our faithfulness. So great was Nebuchadnezzar's anger and his desire that I believe to his desire to save face in front of other court officials that he ordered Daniel's friends burned alive. But their faith was evident when they said in verse 17, God can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, which is critical to note, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you set up. Folks, we would probably struggle just to maintain our belief that God could rescue us, let alone saying that if he chose not to do so, we would remain faithful. What a testimony to the trust these individuals had for Almighty God. Which brings us to this. Walking through the fire is a powerful witness. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire? Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Verse 26, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair of their heads was singed. Their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this. Then it says in verse 30, the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The king could not believe what he was seeing. There were 3 men alive and well in the midst of the fire, and they were not alone. So great was God's protection that when they came out of the furnace, not only were they unharmed, Daniel's friends also didn't even smell like smoke. The king was certainly impacted by what he had witnessed. He immediately acknowledged the Most High God, and he proclaimed that the name of God should be revered by all in his kingdom, under penalty of capital punishment. While we may not be required to walk through literal fire like Daniel's friends, we must understand that the choices we make have an impact on those around us. And whether we must face a furnace or just say no to what others consider to be harmless fun, we should choose to do what we know to be right. Our witness is underpinned by our actions and our choices. May we be as faithful as Daniel's friends were when they said no, regardless of the threats that they faced. May God bless you and your family this week.